that's a really fundamental skill that does creep into other areas of your painting. So I think to paint that neatly this early on is a really, really good time for future things to come.
Testament to your brush control, because it takes a lot of effort and pressure and control to actually do that, which is good.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Critique Clinic, the video series where we give our patrons and you advice on how you can improve your miniature painting.
We've got some really awesome miniatures to have a look at today, so let's jump straight in.
Okay, first up we have T-Bear, who says, "Hello Siege and friends. This is the capstone model to my Leviathan box of Ultramarines. I painted my first model 6 months ago. I'm still pretty slow. I've been doing my best for this first batch of miniatures to match the box art in the heavy metal style, so I can easily judge my progress. I was excited to do some freehand on this model, test some OSL and try some weathering techniques. It's also my first large model, and I think it's by far my best. Some areas I need help in are the satin varnish I have been using, created some texture on the surface. Is there a way to fix it? How do you keep the brightness and saturation high when doing OSL, and any other advice you might have?"
So first, I've got to say, for 6 months painting, you've done a really, really great job on the model. Like, it's blocked in really cleanly, sectioned really nicely. Everything's really readable. Just comes across really well when you look at it in photos, which I think is a real testament to sort of like how you're pushing yourself when you're painting, which is good. I think like the OSL is nicely done. It's not too much, not sort of like very minimal. It's a nice amount, and it shows like the weapon is almost like just fired or something, especially with the way that the actual barrels are glowing at the end as well. I think that's quite a cool little thing that you've done. But yeah, overall it's really, really clean, nicely executed. I think that like there's obviously that you can always do things sharper, neater, smoother, all that kind of stuff. But really, for a model from somebody who's only been painting 6 months, you've got to take a step back and be like, this is good for 6 months. You know what I mean? So I
think regardless of that, I mean, for any level of painting, there's a lot on show here. I mean, even down to there's some like glaze shading on the panels. Everything's been edge highlighted really, really nicely.
Text on the purity seal looks good as well.
Yeah, you got some really nice like refined scratching and weathering. And that's without mentioning the freehand as well, which we'll get to in a moment.
Yeah. So in regards to the varnish, I think one of the things is, and now obviously we don't know how you've applied the varnish. If you're using like a rattle can or a spray can to varnish it, I personally don't recommend that. Well, just from personal experience, and also just it sometimes doesn't lead to the best results. If you're airbrushing it and doing varnishing with an airbrush, then it is about having a really nice thinner dilution so that you can do multiple thin layers to put that protective varnish on the model. Sometimes texture does occur when, like, if a spray can hasn't been mixed thoroughly, or for example, you're maybe like holding the can a little bit further away, so the varnish is drying mid-flight and it's hitting it in a sort of tacky state, and then it starts to build up. There's quite a few variables, and without literally being there with you while you're doing it, it's not like it's easy to just discern an answer as to why you've got it. I
would say in regards to fixing it, to be honest, I don't know that there's a lot you can do
not really,
at this stage. I'm inclined to say kind of just be okay with it.
Yeah.
Treat it as a learning curve.
Experience.
And then, crack on with the next one.
Yeah.
I think that you're going to get away with it more on a bigger model like this anyway, just because it's physically larger and they're quite flat panels.
Exactly.
I think that if you're getting this on smaller models, that grain and sort of added texture is going to kind of scale up. It's going to seem a lot
100%.
bigger.
Yeah.
But that being said, I mean, there are limitations, like you said, to sort of using certain products. And even then, sometimes varnish can be a bit fickle, can't it? Like sometimes something that you use all the time and is super dependable, you make a mistake in terms of how you thin it, or it might have been a particularly humid day or a cold day or something.
Yeah,
it is just one of those things, unfortunately, I think.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I said, look, I don't think it detracts from the model that massively in this case. I think the model's still really nicely painted and presents itself really well. So I know obviously, look, when you're the person who's painted it and you're looking at it, it might bug you, but to the general observer that doesn't know all the nuances of what's gone into painting the model, they're not going to notice it that much. So don't worry. I mean, I've got to say this, like the free-handed like falcon or eagle on the side of the shoulder of the dreadnought looks great.
I don't think I'd want to give that a go.
No, I mean, no, it's quite an awkward shape as well, the way it's like stretching its legs out to sort of like grab something as well, like some prey or something. It's really cool. Like, I think, again, you've done a great job of incorporating not only some freehand onto there, but also weathering it as well. You've got the white sort of like unit identifying markings as well. So you've got some really cool things going on there. And look, it reads really well as like a falcon or an eagle. You've done a great job in doing it. So yeah.
I don't know if it's 100% intentional necessarily or not, but even the painting style reminds me of like World War II.
Yeah, definitely.
When they'll paint stuff on, it almost looks like it's been painted on by 100%. The Marine, if that makes sense.
No,
which I think really works. I think that looks really, really cool.
Yeah, it does look great.
One final note just before we wrap up. I think in terms of like where to go next for your painting, because like you're emulating the box art style, as you've said, and as is evident from the painting. I think that the next step for just sort of a easy way to sort of improve what you've already done would be just add some additional brighter highlight stages on some of the corners and sharp areas of the panels.
Definitely.
So in particular, as an example, we've got sort of like here on the sort of abdomen area, and then maybe potentially, I think you've done it a little bit on some of these like knee pads, but just picking out like, you know, a second or a third brighter stage, which again, you have done in some areas, but I think just going like even brighter and just nice and refined with it on some of like these little like corner points where sort of certain sections intersect, particularly on the really, really sharp corners. I think it can just bring out that detail just a little bit more and add a little bit more contrast.
Yeah, definitely. So overall, again, for a model that from somebody who's been painting for 6 months, you're doing great. I think you shouldn't be so harsh on yourself and some of the things you've said. I think that literally just keep pushing yourself, take some of the feedback on board, just concentrate on being neater, sharper, smoother, and more refined. And all of these things will just add to the already really good foundation that you've got as a painter. And you're doing great.
Yeah, 100%. Thanks for submitting, and we look forward to seeing what you paint next. Next up, we have Columbo, who says, hey guys, it's now been 4 months into hobby and painting. I would love to get feedback on the execution of this model, areas to improve, and potential things to try out next. This Black Legion Terminator features lots of edge highlighting, where I try to be as neat as I can. It's my first attempt at painting a face, and an experiment with steel non-metallic metal on his sword. Okay, well, first up, once again, as is on brand, we've got another beginner who is absolutely smashing it.
4 months. They're getting younger. What's going on? They're getting younger.
Regardless of the short amount of time painting, I would say this is a really lovely miniature overall.
Yeah, really well painted, yeah.
Yeah, I think everything's blocked in really, really nicely. I mean, it's a very iconic Black Legion scheme, isn't it? I know exactly what it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
Straight from looking at it.
That's exactly what it says on the ceramite.
100%.
Yeah.
I think the thing that was most impressive to me, actually, where I see a lot of beginners and more experienced painters slip up is in terms of the trim, particularly on Chaos Marines. This is so neatly blocked in. There's absolutely no bleed one way or another onto the actual armor panels, which is fantastic. And I think that's a really fundamental skill that does creep into other areas of your painting. So I think to paint that neatly this early on is a really, really good time for future things to come.
Testament to your brush control, because it takes a lot of effort and pressure and control to actually do that, which is good.
Yeah.
So you're doing fantastic.
100%. Obviously, this is painting like a box art style, which I think looks great.
Never going to complain about that.
My main sort of direction to steer you towards next would be Chaos Marines in particular are quite difficult for this, and that's the sort of inner negative edge highlight that they like to do, particularly on like armor panels where there's trim. So we see it here, for example, on the leg. You've got like your standard edge highlight, which is on like a physical edge, like here on the hip plate, for example, where you can see it sort of on the actual physical corner of the panel. But then you've also got these sort of internal inner ones, panels where it's not actually an edge. No. You're kind of edge highlighting it to add that separation between like the trim, for example, which I think is fine.
It just looks odd when you've got every other part of it edged, and then obviously you've got like an internal part that doesn't have an edge. But 100%.
I mean, they do it on the box art style, so I completely understand why you have done it. But it's one of those things that unless you can get it like super duper razor sharp, like all the way to the very, very edge, personally, I'd advocate for just kind of not doing it. Or maybe just partially doing it on like...
or just do like the more desaturated one first. Don't do the more brighter highlights.
Yeah, potentially. I think the reason I'm pointing this out is because I think compared to the rest of your edge highlighting, I think that it is probably just slightly weaker there. And again, it is very, very difficult, and especially where these aren't straight lines anywhere, they're quite wavy.
No, I think that's down to the fact that those are executed with a pull stroke rather than the side of the brush highlight. So like they are harder factually because you've got to maintain the pressure as you're doing the draw. So... but they're still sharp, but obviously they're just comparatively, when you're trying to refine stuff down as much as possible, you're wanting all the edges to be the same in the sense of the execution. And that's where you do have disparity just because of the way they've been put on. But it's just practice, honestly. Like you'll get it. You're 4 months. You're laughing, honestly. You're laughing. You're going 100%. Great.
And that is like pretty nitpicky feedback, but that's again, just a testament to the sort of the level that you're at.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think it's just one of those things of, it looks like, I like to say almost, it looks worse than it is because the rest of the paint job is so good.
Yeah.
It's correct, just that one little thing that's kind of pulling everything back just a tiny little bit. Because you're really capable of doing some lovely highlights. Like we're seeing it here on the cloth in particular. Like I said, the hip plate is razor sharp.
Yeah.
So I'd maybe just have a little bit of a think and strategize about how you're going to execute those sort of internal
100%
internal highlights just to sharpen them up a little bit.
So yeah, I really liked the sword that you done. I thought the sword was good. Love a bit of blending, I do, and I think you've done a great sort of effect on there for sort of like steel. I know you mentioned obviously non-metallics as well. It's quite nice because you've done the actual highlight stages quite harshly as well, which is good because metallics, when they hit light, sometimes they don't have like perfectly smooth blends from the different tones that are on there. They do have quite harsh kind of like lighting when light hits, like especially sort of gleaming steel or like metallics and stuff like that. So I think what you've done is actually really great. All the blending looks nice and smooth. I think there's, again, you've got some patchiness there a little bit, but I think that only adds to the effect of like the metal as well, which is quite nice.
It's got a lot of depth, hasn't it? As
Yeah,
well,
definitely.
Especially in the shadow. Like, I mean, you're going all the way here from basically black to white, aren't you? So that's really helping the sort of shine and gleaming effect.
Yeah, it looks great. Looks really good. I did just notice one thing that I wanted to comment on that I think, it's not like a super negative thing, and it's only because, again, 4 months, it might not be something that you know of. But there's a really good product out there called Microsol Microset, which is used for working on transfers. The transfer you applied looks great in the sense of how you've applied it, the positioning, all the way that it actually sits on the model. But you can see obviously the edge of the transfer film. So something to just be conscious of is that what you can use is a product called Microsol Microset. It's a 2-part chemical mix that basically allows you to kind of melt the transfer and shrink the transfer so it adheres.
It kind of makes that like clear film on the top disappear, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And it gives you that like painted on look of the transfer.
100%. And I definitely recommend you give that a go. Again, with the skill that you've got of all the things you've executed on the model, using those 2 chemicals won't be a problem at all whatsoever. But again, that's being really nitpicky just on the transfer. The position of it looks great. The way you put it on, it's smooth, all that kind of stuff. It's just getting rid of that little sort of film, the visible film on the outside of the transfer that will help just sell the marking and sell the model a bit better.
Yeah. An additional alternative to that would be, as you've already got this on fairly smoothly anyway, just brush varnishing on top of this shoulder pad. That would basically help help that kind of disappear. If you just get some, I think Citadel do like Ard Coat, or I think there's another one, which you can just use straight out of the bottle, or you can just buy like an airbrush varnish or just something in a dropper bottle, anything like that you can apply with a brush.
Yeah.
Just doing a thin coat of a matte varnish over the top of that will help kill it and kind of blend it in as well.
Definitely, yeah. So yeah, rounding up on the model, again, for 4 months painting, you cannot be complaining with where you're at. You've done absolutely amazingly. And like these things that we picked out on the model about like the little things to just tweak and refine, that's only just going to push it even further from the level that it's at now. You've done a great job, and you should be really, really proud of where you're at as a painter for 4 months, and then the quality of work that you're executing. And it's good to see that you're being sort of brave with like the things that you're doing. You're not letting sort of like fear stop you from maybe doing like a blended weapon or things like that. You've done really well. So well done.
Amazing. Thank you very much for submitting, and we look forward to seeing what you do next. So do let us know in the Discord. And thank you very much. Next up, Steel Fur says, I would love some detailed feedback on this model. I've been painting since last October, so this was a big push piece for me. Like you said in a recent episode, this was a competition piece that I started doing just to have a hard deadline and push myself to try something new with the base and armor. Lots of time spent on the armor panels doing details, and then almost ruined it with overdoing the battle damage. Already got ideas that I need to work on the blends and the armor, and maybe more time spent tidying up my colors to make sure everything is exactly the right place. But I'm keen to hear what you make of it. Okay, well, firstly, overall, I quite like the concept of this sort of mini scene of the bridge. Yeah. It's kind of like you kind of cut the whole scene off kind of end by end. I really like sort of pieces like that where you can kind of imagine what's going on around it. You can think of this maybe being like a huge bridge or something like that.
It's like that bit in Khazad Dûm in Lord of the Rings where the stairwell is moving. It's kind of like
so that's really cool. I really like a scene like that. And I like the sort of added flavor that you've got by putting the additional models on there as well. So you haven't just got this centerpiece rider, you've also got the additional one jumping off there as well.
Getting the hell out of the way.
Yeah. I think the color scheme is nice with the sort of orange rust kind of weathering. I think works really well with the blue, obviously, in terms of color theory and whatnot. But I think for me, perhaps the idea of having the model on foot and the rider as well, having the armor scheme be exactly the same as the sort of big monster here as well, I think
gets a little bit lost.
It gets a little bit lost. It might be like more lore correct or make more faithful sense to an army, but just visually in terms of like a competition piece. I think the idea of having a bit more variation in terms of the colors of the armor panels might help to kind of just separate the details and make it a little bit more readable.
Yeah.
Because kind of the further back you are, it kind of becomes this one sort of seamless shape of armor rather than looking at all of the sort of individual details. Definitely. It's a little bit lost.
No, definitely.
And I think just some small choices like changing some of them to be like metallic or some of them to have like be a bit more weathered than others, or even just deciding to say like, hey, the rider's going to, have black armor or yellow armor or something. Just something to mix it up a little bit.
No, I agree.
Just to make each individual part of the model a little bit more readable. I think that would go a long way.
Yeah, no, definitely. For me, again, I agree totally on everything George said about the sort of the armor and the colors and the actual thing. For me, it's actually the base. I think that concrete or stone is such an interesting material when you actually look at it in real life. It's got loads of different tones, colors, hues, finishes, all those kind of things, like textures that are on it, like marks and chips. That stone was carved to build that bridge, so all those blocks are going to have different angles and things on them, little marks and things like that. And I think when you look at the piece overall, the time investment, you can clearly see you put a lot of time obviously into the armor, doing the rust and all those details and things like that, and adding the texture and details on there. But it's a shame that the actual sort of base part of it doesn't have that. Like concrete would have that as well. And I think if you go into as much, you don't necessarily have to sit there and do every single little mark and every single little bit with a paintbrush. You could sponge it on various different tones. You could do loads of different things.
Big dry brush even.
Big dry brush. You can do, and then you can even just do the odd scratch with a brush here and there just to add a little more of like a harsh or abrasive mark, or just to add a little bit of like a detailed area that you want to focus the eye or draw the eye onto something. But I think when you look at the piece overall, you can see that the kind of like the base has been done secondary, if that makes sense. And I think that if you were just to balance it and put as much effort and time and interest into that as well, it would just round out the model a little bit more. Again, it's a really great execution. I love the idea, I love the composition, love the kind of way you've done it. It's really cool, especially the kind of like icy kind of like base as well. I think that's quite a cool little detail. But yeah, I think that's what I would probably comment on, is just adding a bit more interest to the stone. I think that will help massively.
Yeah, I completely agree. But otherwise, it's a really nice piece and it's a really cool concept overall.
Definitely.
I think just spending a little bit of extra time in regards to the base, like James said. And then again, it's just one of those learning curve things as well. I think maybe, I'm not suggesting that you go in and repaint all of these armor panels to change the color scheme. I think it's just something to bear in mind on like future projects, for example.
Definitely, yeah.
But all of those things in combination is just about selling and reading all of the individual details of the piece, because you spend so much time on it. You just want to be able to make sure that the viewer can very, very clearly pick all of those out at a glance,
100%. Yeah, definitely.
But otherwise, massive commendation on going for your first competition piece, especially early on painting.
It's really good.
And I hope that the deadline helped you see a lot of improvement in your brush skill.
100%.
Yeah, thank you for submitting. We look forward to seeing what you do next. Next up, we've got Rogue404, who says, "Hi all, love the podcast and would love some feedback on this chap. I've left the loincloth/parchment blank to match my army scheme, but I would love for some pointers on doing the tiny text on scrolls and books, etc. I feel like this could be one of the cleanest models I've done so far, but I'd love to hear your feedback on it and ways I could step it up further."
So we're not sure how long you've been painting this one. So hopefully, I was going to say, like, hopefully it's not, you're going to turn around and go, I've been painting like 2 weeks or something like this. You've done great, like really, really good. There's only a few things I think on this that for me that just caught the eye, and it's just, they're almost like, oh, you could just add this and then it would do that. So there's only a few little bits for me to talk about on this. First thing is first, the model is really, really well sectioned. Like everything reads really well. It's all base coated and painted really neatly and refined, which I think is great. So just keep doing what you're doing and just constantly squeeze tighter, sharper, neater, smoother. But other than that, like, it's phenomenal. The two areas that I wanted to sort of like discuss and bring up were, like, first things first is like the bone. I think the bone could do with way more contrast on it. Again, what you've done is great. You've added like a shade on there. I can see that definitely. And there are like the ones that are on the sort of like the bits that are hanging down. You can see there's like a bit of a highlight on there. I think that's good. But I think really you can add so much more depth to the actual the bone work on there. Like all the teeth kind of get a little bit lost, obviously, on the skull a little bit. I can see you've painted them.
Yeah, we'd really have to zoom in here, but there is a sort of recess just along the sort of top line of the teeth and just under the bone of the nose as well.
Definitely, yeah. I think it just needs a more contrast just to really define that. And also as well, look, skulls are kind of good and they're also bad, and I want to explain why. They're good because they're one of the most instantly recognizable things that a human eye is trained to see, like a face or a skull, etc. The reason that's bad is because when you don't do a lot of highlighting or contrast on them, it's instantly visible that they've not got that much shade or sort of like contrast on them.
They're quite smooth as well, so it can be a little bit difficult because it's not. You have got a lot of angular details, particularly around like the eye sockets and the teeth and the nose and whatnot. Yeah. In terms of the actual like dome part of the head, because they're so smooth, it's quite difficult to add shading in there because you don't instinctively. You've got to do very much volumetric highlighting and shading in that regard because there's no like defined recess to kind of shade or edge to highlight.
No, you're right, 100%. That for me was the main thing that kind of like stood out. I think only from looking at the model and scrutinizing it a bit closer. I think another thing that I think think will help massively is actually your lenses, and they're not just the ones within the helm. Obviously, I noticed them first of all, obviously looking at the skeleton helm that he's got, but also like the optical arrays that are left and right of the head. I think that you could easily push that more with like adding more like on the curve of the sort of coronal highlight of the lens. You could easily add in like some orange, maybe some yellow, some ice yellow as a final like little dot or something like that, or the brightest point opposite the white catch light. I think that would really help just add a lot of depth and a lot of like lighting onto those specific details. You've also got the kind of like the ruby in the middle of like the crux on the waist as well. I think that if you're going to paint that as a gem, fair play, you've done it red. Okay, it's really nice. Obviously, you painted it red, but I think that you could really, really add a bit more interest to it by framing it with a bit more shadow around it, so it makes the gem actually look like it's in a setting, and then also adding some more colours to it, as in some oranges and yellows and stuff, just on the opposite of the light catch placement. I think that would help massively just to really define it.
I think orange is usually the best way to go over red. It tends to make it look a lot brighter and more saturated.
Yeah,
I mean,
definitely.
Inherently you want to go like, oh, I'll use the brightest red I have, but I think you kind of need to break past that and go into oranges and even yellows.
Well, a really good example looking at the model is the gun casing. So the gun casing you've done like an orange highlight on. So like look at how that highlight defines the gun casing and really makes the red look more red, if that makes sense. I think that you just need to do that with the...
To be honest, I'd argue even with that, you could potentially go a lot brighter.
Yeah, you could, 100%.
Even on this shot.
We're never going to say don't pump the contrast. So yeah, just literally
I think potentially these could actually be the same colours. It's just because this is a bit larger.
Potentially,
a bit more of it.
But
regardless, I think going up to an orange, I think is a total no-brainer. And it'd be so easy to do, and it would add a lot of contrast value to the miniature.
100%, yeah.
Yeah. So your main question from your comment was in regards to adding text onto the purity seals. First and foremost, I want to say well done on the way that you've actually highlighted and shaded these, because where I see people often going wrong is slapping a wash all over these and then kind of calling it a day.
Yeah.
And they tend to get a lot of pooling and by not going back in and adding like the highlights and whatnot on top, I think it can often just look like what it is, where you've just kind of slapped the wash in it.
Yeah.
I can tell there's a lot more effort which has been put into these, which is really, really nice, because parchment typically I wouldn't expect to be super dark and dirty kind of anyway. But regardless of that, I think this looks really, really nice. So you've kind of already done all of the legwork and you're kind of ready for the text.
Yeah, definitely.
My suggestion would be, counterintuitively, use a fairly big brush.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that is what you really want to be concerned with is getting the sharpest tip that you can, and not just going, okay, I want to do a tiny detail, you need to use a tiny brush.
Yeah.
The issue that you'll have with a tiny brush is it's just going to dry out way too fast. And particularly with adding lots of lines of text, you kind of need that control.
Definitely,
so if you're dotting the pupil of an eye, you've only got to hit that one brush stroke. So it kind of doesn't matter if the brush dries out really quickly.
No, definitely.
Because you've only got to execute that one dot or that one line.
No, exactly.
Whereas if you're doing lots and lots of squiggles and lines of text on a massive piece of parchment,
you want the brush to flow as long as possible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you'll typically find that with larger brushes, they tend to have as sharp of a tip anyway.
Yeah.
So it's just at that point about getting the control of the dilution of the paint and how much you've loaded up in the brush itself. So my advice would be to get some fairly thin paint, and before you start applying it to the model, just brush most of it off on the back of your hand or on a glove ideally, rather than just on your bare skin. But getting most of that paint kind of wicked off so that when you touch the model, you don't get that point where the paint just wants to sort of like soak and splodge off. So getting kind of as little amount of paint left over on the brush as you can, but it's still going to be fairly moist because it's a decent sized brush. It's not going to dry out right away. So once you've done that, it's really just about getting the fine control. I prefer to think of it, rather than doing a squiggly line, just think of it about doing a horizontal line, and you can kind of work up to that.
No,
so first things first, if you've never really done it before, I would say just focus on getting a nice horizontal line, even if it's pretty straight. I think that's going to look pretty good anyway, especially at this scale. And then once you've done some repetition of that, you can work up to adding a little bit of a wobble to kind of make it look more like simulated text. But I think it's one of those things as well where once you've practiced it a couple of times, you'll be surprised how quickly you can get decent at it. So I would say if you've got even just a piece of paper, just give it a go on there before you hit the model, because once you've got like 3 or 4 or 5 brush strokes kind of out and you've got a bit of a feel for it, you're going to wish that you'd not done those on the model initially, right? But it's just one of those practice things, I think. But it can be much easier than you think it is. Hopefully there's been some examples on screen throughout of how I like to execute that. But I think, just give it a go. I think, like I said, paper would probably be a great place to start, or at least just get a couple of brush strokes off on there before you hit the model. And then you'll find that by the time once you've done a few purity seals, then kind of becomes muscle memory.
Yeah, you'll be scribing away like you've never thought you could. So yeah.
But Otherwise, a fantastic miniature. We hope that you can implement those little points and push it even further. And thank you for submitting. And finally, but not least, we have Elbow, who says, "Hi all, looking for some feedback on my Tau. I'm happy with the color depth on the orange and the slapdash damage. Just wondering what else to add or change. Not sure what color to paint the circular bit on the breacher's gun and the shoulder Tau symbol."
So a really awesome, vibrant Tau scheme, which I think is good. I think the use of color theory on it is good, but I think there's some things that, in an opinionated statement, I probably would have done a little bit different just to use some other colors, and I'll go into a bit of detail on that. But before we just say anything, your resin pour. Can we talk about that? Like, it was.
It's so clean. I didn't quite notice it.
We didn't even
first.
notice it. Yeah, we were like, "Is that a resin pour?" Oh, it is a resin pour. Yeah. So, well done on getting the resin pour on there. I think that's absolutely phenomenal. But onto the models. I think again, orange is a real tricky one to get good tonal variance on. I think because obviously a lot of orange paints are quite close in sort of their vibrancy or hue. And I think that you've done a really good job of incorporating a bit of yellow in there to boost it slightly higher in some areas. And it looks like there's a little bit of like a sepia kind of tone that you've applied to some of the lower portions or shadow portions, which I think is good.
It's nicely done because you kind of see it two ways. Sometimes you see yellow painted to the point where it looks orange because there's too much shading.
100%.
And then sometimes you see orange painted in a way that it looks yellow because there's too much highlighting.
Yeah.
But I'd say the balance here is actually pretty much spot on.
It's
really,
spot on,
isn't it?
yeah. Done amazingly.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have gone with blue personally.
No?
I would have gone with purple. Yellow and orange and purple work really well together. And I understand why you painted like the head red because then you've got yellow, orange, red, blue. I get that totally. But I think purple would have really worked quite nicely with it as well. So I still think...
What kind of purple? Like a lilac-y sort of purple or something quite deep?
Not vibrant, but like quite a like mid-tone purple. Just one that contrasts really nicely to the orange. And the reason why I say purple is because even if you keep some of the red details on there, like the head, you could add like stripes of purple, like almost like marking stripes on some of the orange areas with purple, and it would work really well with the yellow tones and also the orange and the blue as well. I think that because purple is a harmonious color to red, if you kept the red details, then it would work with the red as well. I just think it adds a really nice color to the overall palette, and I think it would just help to break some stuff up. You could use it as like unit identifier, you could use it for like command identifier, you could use it as a really good color just for more of like your elite models potentially, and it would work with the overall encompassing scheme.
That's fair.
But again, the models are done really well. The weathering as well. Like I think the weathering is nice and refined.
It's quite nice and in scale, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I think again, if by the looks of the photos, it looks like you sponged it on, which again, there's nothing wrong with that at all whatsoever. I think probably what I would have liked to have seen is like rather than just doing a solid single color sponge, I would have done like a double sponge layer. I would have done like a even brighter yellow, like an ice yellow or something like that. And then within that, I would then do the dark brown. So then you've got like a two-tone kind of effect on the chipping. I think that
does work nicely because you typically see like battle damage and chipping done with the shade color. I think it does look really nice when you do it with the highlight color as well. Like you said, like going with a really bright yellow
definitely
would actually look really nice. And you could still do that, to be fair. If you go over everywhere that you've already put the black on, just some subtle bright yellow, I think would work really, really nicely. I agree.
It would work really well. But overall, again, like I think for models and the way that you've like sort of executed them, I think they look neat, they look smooth, they look clean. The airbrush work that's on there has been done really well. I don't think like the OSL effects that you've done like with the blue glow is too much as well. Sometimes people go a bit Las Vegas on it and it ends up looking like a billboard. Like,
I would say on that point, I think it's I prefer the look a little bit more on the weapon than I do on the shield. I
agree.
I think I don't mind the sort of glowing part around the edge, but I think that you needed to perhaps go just a little bit brighter in the sort of center point of this shield. I think that the blue is looking a little bit flat purely because the point of the glow is kind of as bright as where the light is sort of emanating from.
Definitely.
I'd have gone in with like a bit more of a like an ice blue, almost kind of white, just right in the center there, just to sell that glow effect just a little bit more, I think.
You could even paint the whole entire tower symbol like gold, and then in the recess create the lighting effect from the recess around the tower symbol.
That's a good idea.
That'd work as well, because you've got quite a few of those golden cogs, sort of like sprocket. I don't know what they are, but
I get what you mean.
Whatever they are, those gold things. There's quite a few of them on there. So the tower symbol being in gold,
the flathead screws.
Yeah, the flathead screws. Exactly that. Yeah, but no, overall, really, really good. I think they're like really well painted. I think again, you can just be clever with like using colors to just add certain sort of things to the models and just work with color theory a bit more. Like I said, you've got good understanding. Primary color triadic scheme, which looks good, but like, yeah, I think you could just add some purple as a harmonious color on there. I think it just give it a bit more of like another colorway to the palette and just add a bit more interest on some areas and things.
Yeah, that's fair. I think as one final point, I think where you've obviously sort of airbrushed the orange armor, I'd have potentially done the heads separate so that you could do some airbrushing on those as well. Because I think by comparison, they're looking a little bit flat to me. I think in part, mainly you haven't blacklined them yet, I don't think, from when this photo's taken. But I think it's just the contrast difference, I think, is a bit too significant for me personally. I think because you've got this really lovely gradient on all of the sort of orange panels, but then the red is just a little bit flat by comparison. Like I said, that might be in part because it's not finished yet necessarily.
Because
I'm noticing that there's not the black lining that there is everywhere else. That being said, if it is finished, then I would say maybe just go in and do some of the black lining on there as well. But then if you've done those heads separately, you didn't glue them on during assembly, then you could do with the airbrush, you could add some, really bright red or almost orange on there just to make that red like really nice and saturated, and it also give that kind of gradient effect that you've got on the rest of the model.
Definitely, yeah, 100%.
Yeah, but otherwise it's a really cool army scheme, and we look forward to seeing how the army turns out. So send us some photos in the Discord. Otherwise, thank you for submitting. Well, a massive thank you to all of our patrons for submitting for this episode of Critique Clinic. If you'd like to get feedback from myself and James on a future episode, then check the link in the description to our Patreon. And as well as Critique Clinic, you'll also gain access to hundreds of high quality PDF and video tutorials, which we update every single week. Otherwise, we thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.